Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, I'll be doing a ranking of every theatrically released film in the Star Wars franchise. So there are 12 films in the Star Wars franchise that were released in theaters. I will not be including the Ewok movies because, those were only released in theaters in Europe. But I will be talking about the 9 Skywalker movies, the 2 anthology films, and the Clone Wars. I initially wanted to do a review of Rise of Skywalker, but I was just so busy with a lot of other videos at that point that I didn't really have the time to make a video on that movie, and now we're pretty much, like a month after the film's release? So instead of just doing a review, I decided, you know what, let's just rank all the films. I guess I should give some context on my relationship with the Star Wars franchise, which is that I'm definitely more in the know than your normal Star Wars viewer that just watches the main series films and that's it. And at this point, obviously, I've watched all the movies, I've played a good chunk of the games, I've read some of the comic books, I've read some of the older books that aren't canon anymore. I'm definitely more in the know with Star Wars than your casual fan, but I'm definitely not a hardcore fan of Star Wars either. I'm very much in between. My first Star Wars film that I watched was The Phantom Menace. I didn't watch it at its release as I was like 4, but I watched it a bit later. Eventually watched the second and third one in theaters, and I've pretty much watched every new film since then. But with that context out of the way, let's get into the actual ranking, starting off with number 12, and I didn't watch until very recently, and that is the Clone Wars. This movie sucks. I really didn't care for it. I've never watched the Clone Wars television series, or really any of the other animated series in general, so I think that's obviously a major factor here. I think if I had watched those when I was a kid, maybe I would like this film more. I just didn't. And watching this movie now, again, I just watched this right before I watched Rise of Skywalker. It's really just not a movie for me. Obviously, it's not for my age bracket. It's for people probably, 15 years younger than me. And to be honest, I consider not even talking about this movie at all just because it's such a random film in the overall series where it's not part of the Skywalker saga. It's not a main anthology film. It's really just something that was just released out of nowhere in 2008. It's just a weird thing. Now, if it's something I watched as a kid, I can watch it back, have some enjoyment based on the nostalgia of it. I still love rewatching episodes of Power Rangers and Digimon and Yu-Gi-Oh! And all these other series that I loved as a kid. But I feel like watching newer kid shows now, for me, is very tough to do, and Clone Wars is definitely an example of that. So for me, it ranks here at number 12. Now, number 11, we have the first in the main series, and it's episode 2, Attack of the Clones. I never cared for it. I hated it even when I was a kid. I hate it now. It's just not a good movie. The thing about it, though, is I do think it introduces a lot of interesting lore into the Star Wars franchise, but when looking at it as a film on its own right, it's simply not good. The dialogue is very poor, the acting is terrible, there's absolutely no chemistry between Anakin and Padme, and I feel like overall it's just a movie that doesn't really stick to my mind. Mind you, I have not watched this movie in about, 2 years or so it has been a little while since I've watched this, but for me, it's just a movie that doesn't stick to my mind. It has actively bad parts about it as well. Narratively, I think it's one of the least important Star Wars films in the franchise, where I feel like you could just jump from 1 to 3 and still pretty much get what's going on. So for me, Attack of the Clones is kind of just a boring and at points actively bad movie, so it ranks here at number 11. Now number 10 is another movie that just didn't stick to my mind, and it's not a bad movie. I actually think this is probably a better movie than the next 1 or 2 movies that we'll be talking about, but it still didn't really attach to me, and that is Solo, A Star Wars Story. Now, I didn't actually watch this one when it came out. I just really had no interest in it, but I did get around to watching it when it came out on Netflix, and I watched it, and it was okay. It was fine. There's very few things I could say that's actively bad about it, but there's very few things I could say that's good about it. It's a fine film. One that has some solid performances, has some solid scenes. There's some dumb things, like how Han Solo got his name. I think that's dumb, but I really like the scene where Han Solo meets Chewbacca. I thought that was pretty good. There are good things in this movie. If I was ranking this just solely off of how it is as a movie, I think it's a 7 out of 10. But when ranking it as a Star Wars movie, for me, it's so pointless. There's no reason for this movie to exist. No one wanted this movie. No one needed this movie. So for me, it ranks here at number 10. Now, number 9 is a movie I do have a lot of nostalgia for, and that's, I'll be honest, it's probably why it is above Solo here, but it's not good, and that's The Phantom Menace. The Phantom Menace is a movie that, again, it was the first Star Wars film I ever watched, and it was one that I loved at the time. Obviously, as time has gone on, I've rewatched the movie multiple times. This is another one, by the way, I've not watched in about 2 years, but I think a lot of the movie is just so blah, so dialogue heavy about stuff that I really don't care about. Stuff that, again, I do think this movie does expand the lore, and at least you can give it credit for that, but as an actual thing that you're gonna watch, it's not fun to watch. I think Jar Jar Binks to me at this point is kind of like laughably bad. Like I actually enjoy watching Jar Jar Binks just because of how bad of a character he is. But the main reason it is this high though is because I adore the Darth Maul fight scene. I love the scene where Qui-Gon Jinn gets killed and then Obi-Wan takes him down himself. I just think that's such a fantastic fight sequence. And Darth Maul himself is just such a menacing sort of villain that I felt very weird putting it below Solo, which is something that I just didn't care about. So while The Phantom Menace is filled with flaws, and again, as I said, I don't think it's a better movie than Solo. It's just for me, I have more of a personal connection with it, and I think it has higher highs than something like Solo. So for me, it ranks here at number 9. Now, number 8, we have the most recent film. We have The Rise of Skywalker, and this is a film that really divided the audience. Some people loved it, some people hated it. I don't absolutely hate the film in the sense that I do think it's an enjoyable film to watch. I think I could put it in the background, have some fun with it. But it's not a well-made film. I mean, when you look at the writing is just abysmal. The opening crawl is like one of the most ridiculous things I've ever seen in film, where they just reveal that Palpatine is back and for some reason announced it to the entire galaxy. It's like, why? Why is this a thing? The fact that we're not even getting an explanation of how Palpatine has returned, but also Palpatine just decided to tell everyone that he's back. It's so ridiculous. And I feel like this movie just feels so disjointed. I mean, obviously after coming after The Last Jedi, which we'll talk about very soon, it feels like this is a movie where J.J. Abrams just eliminated The Last Jedi and continued on with his plans from The Force Awakens anyway, like without actually caring about any sort of consistency within the narrative. And I think that's a massive flaw of this movie. I know a lot of people have said that, oh, Rise of Skywalker's made me like the previous films less. For me, that's not the way I think about media. For me, The Rise of Skywalker is just bad as a final film in the trilogy. I mean, it's not the job of the previous films to connect with later films. It's the job of the later film to connect with the previous films. And Rise of Skywalker just completely fails at that. I also thought there were a lot of like just dumb deaths that happened for no reason. Like I thought Ben died for almost no reason. Why'd we kill him off? I don't love the way they killed off Leia. I think it would have been better if they just killed her off in between movies and then had some flashbacks with her. Again, Palpatine was just kind of ridiculous in this movie. Like I don't know why he was there. Kind of feels like he was just shoehorned in there just for some fan service. I think the final scene is also kind of dumb where the old woman asks Rey who, and then she says Skywalker. It's so dumb. Like, why does this old lady care about her last name? Like, obviously they're trying to build this up as like a big epic moment for the conclusion of this entire saga, but I just feel like it falls so flat on every aspect of it. So again, as an individual film, I don't mind it. It's not a bad movie, but when you connect it to every other film as a part of the franchise, it's a complete mess. It doesn't conclude the Skywalker saga in a satisfying way. It doesn't conclude this sequel trilogy in a satisfying way. So for me, it ranks here at number 8. Now at number 7, we have The Last Jedi, and I was also part of the people that didn't like The Last Jedi. And spoiler alert, I was a big fan of The Force Awakens, and I had a lot of expectations coming into The Last Jedi. And for The Last Jedi, just to throw all those away was really mind-boggling to me. I mean, Rian Johnson's the director I really respect. I really love films like Brick and Looper. But for him to come into this Star Wars franchise, for him to be making a sequel to The Force Awakens, and him just deciding just to throw it all away is one of the weirdest things I've ever seen in media. I mean, the fact that this sequel trilogy had no plan is such a disappointing aspect of it. But let's talk about the movie itself. I did not particularly care for what they did with Mark Hamill. I don't mind him being sort of a disgruntled old man, but I do wish his relationship with Rey was better handled. I do wish that he had a different type of death. The Casino Planet stuff was just really dumb and really pointless. Really were the worst parts of the movie, as it really just dragged it out for no reason. I think the stuff with Kylo Ren and Snoke was really fantastic. I love Snoke's death scene, while it is anticlimactic coming from The Force Awakens, where he was set up to be this really massive villain. And for him to just be killed just like that in this movie, I do think that is disappointing, but I do think that's one of the better scenes in the film, and the fight that follows immediately afterwards is really great as well. Overall, The Last Jedi, to be honest, is a movie that I've grown some respect for over time. I really hated it the first time I watched it, and now I'm kind of more neutral on it, but still not a good film in the overall Star Wars franchise, so for me it ranks here at number 7. At number 6, I have another movie that, I have massive flaws with, but it's another one that I've kind of grown to respect over time to a degree, and that is Rogue One. And Rogue One is a movie that everyone loved when it initially came out. I was actually not one of those people. I was actually kind of let down by it. It was kind of just a generic sort of Star Wars war film where everything was so predictable, obviously, because we knew the outcome. We knew that all these people were going to die. We knew that they were going to get the plans to Leia. We knew a good chunk of what was going to happen in this movie, and I think because of that, I was very underwhelmed the first time I watched it. But I do think through rewatches, I've really grown to respect the movie, even though it does have a lot of flawed elements of it. I do think a lot of the characters are kind of dry, and if not dry, then they have no real development. I feel like Rogue One is kind of like the perfect background movie, where if I'm sitting there watching it, really analyzing every scene, then yeah, it is probably slower, and it's probably pretty dumb at points. But I feel like having it on in the background, you really start to appreciate certain scenes and characters more than I did the first time. Again, it's not a great movie. I do think it takes a while to get its start. I do think the back third of the movie is pretty strong, though, where once they start to execute the plan to get the plans, I do think it's really good from that point on. I do like how they connected this movie, obviously, to episode 4. I do like how they pretty much fix the plot hole from episode 4, where it's why does the Death Star have one specific spot that if you shoot at it, it explodes? That's really dumb. But they explained it here, and I'm really happy that they did that. So overall, Rogue One, again, not a great movie. To be honest, I think as a film, it's probably lower than The Last Jedi and probably on par for Rise of Skywalker. But for my personal enjoyment of it, I do have it here at number 6. Now, number 5, we have a movie that I loved as a kid. Actually, as a kid, this was my favorite Star Wars movie. But I feel like as time has gone on, my opinion of it has kind of dropped a bit over time. And that is Return of the Jedi. And this is obviously the first of the original trilogy films to be on the list. And the thing with this movie is I feel like the middle of it is pretty dull. I really love the beginning with Jabba the Hutt and all that stuff. That's really great. I really love the ending with the Luke and Anakin stuff and Palpatine and all that stuff. It's fantastic. However, that middle section of the movie does drag for me. Obviously, the Ewoks are something that I loved the Ewoks as a kid, but watching it now, it doesn't interest me. There are some good character moments in the middle of the film, but I do feel like it takes a while to get to its resolution. But as a kid, I was a real sucker for the ending of stories, and obviously, Return of the Jedi does end this original trilogy very well. And to me is a much more satisfying conclusion to the franchise as a whole than something like an episode 9. But again, as a movie, I do find flaws with it that do lower my opinion of the film now. So for now, it's here at number 5. At number 4, I have the last movie of the prequels, and that Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. And I actually like this movie. I know people bash on the prequels a lot, and while obviously episodes 1 and 2 are films that I agree with that, and they're very low on my list, episode 3 is one that I legitimately enjoy. I think episode 3 is actually pretty good. I do have issues with certain things. The writing's still not as great as I would like it to be. Then it's Star Wars. I don't think the writing in Star Wars has ever been mind-blowingly great to begin with. But there are some great scenes here. I think obviously seeing the fall of Anakin Skywalker is one of the biggest appeals of this movie. The fight scene at the very end of the film with him and Obi-Wan is fantastic. Seeing the fall of the Jedi Order that obviously leads us into episode 4 is really cool to watch as well. I've mentioned this before in other videos. I'm also a sucker for stories that end with the heroes losing. And obviously Revenge of the Sith is kind of one of those films where even though Obi-Wan technically wins against Anakin, it's still a movie that ends with the heroes in a very desperate position. And because of that, I do enjoy it from that standpoint as well. I just thought the Revenge of the Sith was a pretty good culmination of this prequel trilogy where we get to see the rise of Anakin Skywalker in episodes 1 and 2, and then here we see the fall, and I love watching it. So for me, it ranks here at number 4. At number 3, we have the first film in the franchise. We have episode 4, A New Hope, and I have a lot of respect for this movie. Obviously, A New Hope is what started it all. If it wasn't for this movie, there wouldn't be future installments. However, I think at the end of the day, though, this is a very basic film. It's a film that takes a lot of tropes from other genres, but then makes it into a sci-fi film. And while it was innovative at the time, and it is still enjoyable to watch, it's still a movie that comes off to me as very simplistic, especially when we compare it to a lot of these other films that really build on the lore or have more complex narratives. It's just a very small film. It's a very basic film. Well, it's obviously cool to see the origins of Luke, Han, and Leia, and to see Darth Vader as a really menacing villain, and him killing off Obi-Wan, and destruction of the Death Star. There are good scenes within this movie, but for me, it is a bit basic. So for me, it ranks here at number 3. Now, number 2, I know some people are probably going to be upset at this, especially based on my explanation for the previous film, but at number 2 here, I have The Force Awakens, which to me is a better version of A New Hope. I think it takes the formula of A New Hope, but then also expands it into what could have been a very impressive trilogy. Sadly, we didn't get that. But I do think there's a lot of setup within this film that could have led to really cool storylines in future installments if J.J. Abrams had control of the trilogy from the get-go. Obviously, because he didn't want to do it at the beginning, and they decided to hire other directors, and he eventually comes back, it becomes very disjointed, this entire sequel trilogy. But I do think if we take The Force Awakens as its own individual film, I do think it's a very good movie. I mean, it's such a great nostalgia trip, where again, it pretty much takes A New Hope and redoes it for a modern audience, while also including characters from the past, like Han Solo and Leia and obviously Luke at the very end. But I just think it does what it wants to do so masterfully that it is a shame that we didn't get to see the payoff that I would have wanted in The Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker. But I do think this was a good introduction to a lot of these characters like Poe and Finn and Rey. And while the beats of the film are very predictable, I do feel like it utilizes those beats and expands upon them. And I feel like that's the main reason I really love The Force Awakens. I loved it at the time. I still love it now. I know it's a movie that has gone down in people's opinions over time, but for me, I still love it as much as I did the first time I watched it, so for me, it ranks here number 2. Now for number 1, the number 1 movie in the Star Wars franchise for me is obviously Empire Strikes Back. I mean, for me, it's not really close. I do think Empire Strikes Back takes what A New Hope did, taking a very small, generic sort of space heist sort of film and turns it into the epic saga that we see now. I mean, there's obviously so many iconic scenes from this movie. The stuff on Hoth, we have the first appearance of Yoda and Luke being trained by Yoda. We have the Han and Leia relationship. We have obviously the I am your father. And that entire fight scene between Luke and Darth Vader is really fantastic. And I mentioned this before, my favorite stories in media are usually those where the hero loses. And that comes from my love of Power Rangers. And my favorite episodes of Power Rangers would always come from the penultimate episode of the season, where the Rangers lose all of their powers and all of their Zords. And that carried over into something like Avengers Infinity War, where I adore that film because that's where the Avengers lose. And I feel like The Empire Strikes Back is a very similar style of narrative, where Luke loses his arm and finds out that his biggest enemy is also his father. I think that's a major twist for this franchise. It's such a great setup for, obviously, Return of the Jedi. Now, obviously, when watching this film, things do feel outdated. It's not a perfect movie by any means. I mean, there's obviously things in this movie that don't line up with what happened in A New Hope. But outside of that, I really enjoyed my experience when watching this movie. I mean, every time I rewatch it, I enjoy it more and more. Whenever I think of Star Wars, this is the movie that I think of, so for me, it ranks here at number 1. So there we go, that is my ranking of every film in the Star Wars franchise. I know obviously people won't agree with my opinions, but they are my opinions, so yeah. That's my ranking of the Star Wars films. Thank you for watching.